Greetings. In this segment, I will briefly talk about uh, the behavioral theories. Let me first briefly discuss social learning theory. The idea here, and probably what we would hear about in criminology and criminal justice, is the whole idea that people learn to commit crimes just as they learn to be law-abiding citizens. So, for example, violent behavior is learned through the socialization process through modeling. That if someone's brought up in a environment where there is a family and or peer culture of violent behavior, they may learn and internalize that and believe that that behavior is all right to engage and with others. And so you have that situation. And there's a lot of debate on how influential parents are versus peers. And uh, some would say that the parental influence is extremely important, and that really sets the baseline for the characteristics of the individual. And others would say that parental influence is very important until the peer group comes around and either sustains positive um, parental influences or destroys it or disrupts it with negative. Of course, there could be a situation of very negative family influences, and the person is exposed to positive peer influences. So, the combinations here, but there's still a lot of debate how important are parents, and then, of course, how important are peers and peer groups. Working in the mental health field, a lot of times I would have referrals from the criminal justice system of adolescents who engage in illegal activity, fighting, using drugs, breaking and entering, assault, things of that nature. And often the parent would come in and say, my kid's a really good kid and we have a really good family environment and he or she just hanging out with the wrong group. What baffled my mind is then another parent would come in and say, um, basically the same thing. My kid's really a good kid. We brought him or her up in the right way, a moral value life, and he or she started hanging out with the wrong group, and look what they did. They got into this. And I'm thinking, okay, well, let me see. And the third one comes in, says the same thing. Fourth one comes and says the same thing. The fifth one comes and says the same thing. There are five. Okay, how do I make sense of this? So you kind of see the circular, kind of like the dog chasing its tail in this regard. And really, we'd want to look at peer influence, but also how there is particular deviant leadership and social control in any peer group. And so the social learning theories look at this, and of course how people may model behavior they see in movies or television. For example, um, if and think about it, and I've seen kids before would see movies and then they'd act out some of the behaviors or many years ago, for example, many years ago, with the advent of television, my peers and I watched wrestling, that professional wrestling, and then we would have tag team champion matches in our backyards. And we try these crazy moves and maneuvers that we would have watched and mimic those and say those things and act, like those wrestlers would. And looking back at that, fortunately, we didn't really harm or hurt each other. But later on, when I became a clinician, years later, I saw this adolescent who came in and he had bruising to his heart and chest area, and he wouldn't say how it happened. His parents were real concerned, was he tortured? And so I talked to him a while, and then um, it began to dawn on me years ago. I remember that we would act out, and I asked him, do you watch wrestling? Oh, he watched wrestling. We started talking about that, and sure enough, they would have a masculinity contest to see who could take the most heart punches, where they would take their knuckle and hit here and see if the person would move or flinch or say ouch. And the person who could take the most was the real man. They learned this bizarre, ridiculous, irrational behavior from television. They were acting it out. And of course, I had to work with him to demonstrate that that's really doesn't make a man, or it's not really related to masculinity, and so on and so forth. But you get what I'm getting at here, where you see people act out particular behaviors. Sometimes when you step back and try to be an objective observer, you can see that. But people have role models. I have photographs of my friends years ago who try to model maybe behaviors of rock musicians and dress like rock musicians and have certain hairstyles and so on and so forth. Of course, I've sworn to them I would never show those publicly, especially those that became prominent attorneys or planning or in politics, or whatever the case might be. But we begin to see that situation, and even today, right now, there's a lot of debates going on related to politics as we have elections coming up. If you see this after the elections, you know what I'm talking about still. And you see people have gone back to critique some of the candidates by trying to pick apart their childhood or young adulthood, things they may have done. So, and with the idea that that behavior, becomes constant, which it doesn't, it changes. By the time I turned about 14, I stopped engaging in tag team championship wrestling from Florida, as we called it. There's other stupid things I did. For example, tied a ski rope behind a riding lawnmower and took a styrofoam surfboard and engaged in what we called grass surfing back then. That's basically Southern entertainment in the 70s, if you will. Am I embarrassed to say that? Well, no, because that, for a teenager at the time was considered a lot of fun. Fortunately, no one got hurt. It wasn't illegal, but I can tell you that I saw other teenagers doing illegal things, engaging in destructive behavior, sometimes violence, sometimes using drugs and the like, and that certainly is something to look at. So for myself, I was very fortunate in my whole socialization process that I was able to just do what I want: study, read, write, do things that interest me, that were supported and by the school and my parents and my peers had a positive influence in that regard. And I don't know if I would have turned out to be how I am now if I had lived in a different lifestyle, for better or for worse, depending how you look at it. So you think about these influential factors, and again, all this gets us back into what I discussed earlier, that huge debate: how much free will do we have? Is free will relative? Is it an absolute? How do we measure it? How to make sense of it? What is it? And certainly, if you work in the criminal justice system, you're going to see this in the mitigating factors and, what seems to cause this, what seems to cause that. And what you're going to realize is that it's extremely complex. If you recognize the complexity, if you recognize the ambiguity, if you recognize that we don't have all the answers and that there are a lot of uncertainties, I think you get by much better because you realize that. And so that's kind of just a brief summary. And so I would recommend to begin to think about these theories and approaches, and also begin to think about how they apply to situations that you've observed. One of the recommendations I make to students, instead of trying to memorize these theories like you're a computer, um, is to apply it to situations you know. Maybe you had seen a peer group that engaged in pro-social behavior and another one that engaged in deviant behavior, and you begin to apply social learning theory. Or maybe you think about someone you know and you think about their id, ego, and superego, how that relates. Maybe you've read an interesting case about someone who had a particular brain injury or suffered from brain trauma and their behavior changed, or a case where someone had ingested a particular drug and then engaged in some criminal behavior. Or some new research has come up looking at a genetic link and how they present that and argue about that. So there are a lot of debates, a lot of interest, and I'll wrap up this segment now, and this wraps up this entire chapter. Thank you.